Hey, my friend, you know what nobody talks about? The fact that you can be doing everything right and still feel invisible. Yeah, I'm talking about that specific feeling when you walk into a room and somehow you just don't register the same way others do. It's not dramatic, it's not obvious, but it's there. And here's the kicker. It has nothing to do with what you say. I'm going to tell you something that might sting a little, but stick with me because this changes everything. There are people right now in your life who get more respect, more attention, more influence than you do. And they're not smarter than you. They're not more talented. They're not working harder. In fact, some of them barely seem to be trying at all. So what's the difference? It's invisible. It's happening in a place you can't see, in a space most people don't even know exists. And once you understand this, once you really see it, you can't unsee it. Your entire life will start making sense in a way it never did before. Let me take you back to a moment that changed everything for me. The moment everything clicked. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, nothing special. I was sitting in a coffee shop watching people, not in a creepy way, just observing. And I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was this guy at the table next to me, mid-30s, average looking, nothing remarkable about him. He was with 3 other people, casual conversation, nothing intense. But here's what got me. Every single time he spoke, the entire table shifted. Not dramatically, just they leaned in slightly. The conversation slowed down. People actually stopped talking over each other, and he wasn't saying anything profound. He wasn't louder. He wasn't more animated. If anything, he spoke less than everyone else. That's when it hit me like a freight train. I'd been doing it all wrong for years. See, I used to think influence was about having the right words, about being articulate, confident, well-spoken. So I worked on that. I practiced my communication skills. I read books on persuasion. I studied body language. I did everything you're supposed to do. And you know what happened? Nothing. Well, not nothing. I got better at talking. But people still talked over me. My ideas still got ignored in meetings. I still felt like I had to fight for every ounce of attention I got. It was exhausting. But watching this guy in the coffee shop, I realized something uncomfortable. I'd been focusing on the wrong thing entirely. The thing nobody tells you. Here's what they don't tell you about respect, about influence, about presence. It's not built in the moment you open your mouth. It's built in the silence before you speak, in the way you hold yourself when nobody's looking at you, in the thoughts running through your head that you think nobody can see, but people can see it. Or rather, they can feel it. You know how you can walk into a room and immediately sense tension, even if nobody's arguing, or how you can tell someone's anxious even when they're smiling. That's the same mechanism at work here. People pick up on your internal state instantly, not consciously, but clearly. And this is where most people get stuck. They think, okay, I'll just act more confident. I'll fake it till I make it. So they stand up straighter. They speak louder. They try to project strength. But here's the brutal truth. You can't fake this. Because what people are picking up on isn't your behavior. It's the thinking behind your behavior. And if that thinking is off, no amount of good posture or eye contact will fix it. Let me show you what I mean. The 2 conversations. Every interaction you have is actually two conversations happening simultaneously. The first conversation is the obvious one, the words being spoken, the topics being discussed, the surface level exchange of information. But there's a second conversation happening underneath, a silent one. And this is the conversation that actually matters. This second conversation is about power dynamics, about who's grounded and who's not, about who needs something from this interaction and who doesn't, about who's reacting and who's choosing. And here's the crazy part. Most people have no idea this second conversation is even happening. They're completely focused on the first one, trying to say the right things, make the right points, be understood. Meanwhile, the second conversation is determining everything. It's deciding how much respect you get, how seriously people take you, whether you have influence or you're just there. I remember the exact moment I became aware of this second conversation. I was in a meeting, small team, maybe 6 people. We were discussing the project timeline, and I had a legitimate concern about the deadline. So I spoke up. I explained my reasoning clearly, logically. It made sense. And you know what happened? Nothing. The conversation just moved on like I hadn't spoken at all. But 15 minutes later, someone else raised almost the exact same concern. Same issue, same reasoning. And suddenly, everyone stopped. They discussed it. They took it seriously. They adjusted the timeline. Same words, different outcome. I sat there, confused and honestly a little angry. What was the difference? Why did their concern matter and mine didn't? That's when I started paying attention to the second conversation. What I noticed changed everything. Over the next few weeks, I started watching interactions differently, not listening to what people were saying, but noticing how they were saying it. More importantly, I started noticing what was happening before they spoke. And patterns started emerging, clear patterns. The people who commanded respect, who had influence, who seemed to effortlessly get taken seriously, they all shared something, a quality that was hard to name but impossible to miss once you saw it. It wasn't confidence, at least not in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. It was stillness, not physical stillness, internal stillness, a kind of mental calm that radiated outward without them doing anything. You could feel it in the space around them, in the way they didn't rush to fill silence, in the way they didn't seem affected when things didn't go their way. And the more I watched, the more I realized this stillness wasn't a personality trait. It wasn't something they were born with. It was the result of how they were thinking. Specifically, it came from one simple shift. They weren't reacting to the situation. They were observing it. The difference between reacting and observing. This is going to sound simple, but it's the most important thing I'm going to tell you. Most people go through life in reactive mode. Something happens, they respond. Someone says something, they reply. A situation changes, they adjust. It feels normal. It feels like being engaged, being present, being responsive. But it's actually giving away all your power. Because when you're reacting, you're not choosing. You're being controlled by whatever just happened. Your state depends on external events. Your mood shifts based on how others respond to you. Your sense of stability comes from things outside yourself. And people can feel that dependency. It shows up in tiny ways. the slight hesitation before you speak, the way your tone changes based on how someone looks at you, the extra explanation you add when someone seems skeptical, the subtle adjustment in your energy when the room goes quiet. None of these things are obvious, but together they create a signal that says, my state depends on how this goes. And the moment people pick up on that signal, the dynamic shifts. Not dramatically, just enough that you're no longer operating from a position of strength. You're operating from a position of need. Need for approval, need for validation, need for the interaction to go a certain way. Now compare that to observing. When you're observing, there's space between what happens and how you respond. In that space, you're not being pulled by the situation. You're watching it, processing it, choosing how to engage with it, and that creates something completely different. It creates presence, real presence, the kind that doesn't fluctuate based on what's happening around you, the kind that stays steady even when things get uncomfortable, the kind that makes people naturally pay attention without you demanding it. Why this matters more than you think. Look, I get it. This might sound theoretical, abstract, maybe even a little woo-woo, but I promise you, this is the most practical thing you'll ever learn about human interaction. Because once you understand this difference between reacting and observing, you start seeing it everywhere. In every conversation, in every meeting, in every social situation, you start noticing how often you're reacting when you think you're choosing, how often your state is being controlled by external events when you think you're in control, how often you're giving away power in tiny moments that you don't even notice. And more importantly, you start seeing how to change it, not by forcing yourself to act different, not by faking confidence, not by memorizing techniques or scripts, but by shifting something much more fundamental, the way you process what's happening around you. That's what this entire journey is about. Learning to think like someone who operates from observation instead of reaction. Someone who stays grounded regardless of what's happening. Someone whose presence doesn't depend on external validation, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. But first, you need to understand something critical, something that most people never realize. The reason you've been stuck in reactive mode isn't because you're doing something wrong. It's because you've been trained into it by society, by your upbringing, by every social interaction you've ever had. There's a specific pattern in your thinking that keeps you reactive, a pattern that feels so normal you don't even question it, a pattern that, once you see it clearly, explains everything about why interactions haven't been working the way you want them to. And in the next part, we're going to break that pattern down piece by piece. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you can finally start changing it. The pattern you don't see. Here's something that's going to sound familiar. You're in a conversation. Someone says something you disagree with. Immediately, your mind starts forming a response. Not consciously, just automatically. Before they've even finished speaking, you already know what you're going to say. Or someone challenges your point, and before you can stop yourself, you're explaining, adding more detail, trying to make your position clearer. Or you share an idea and someone looks skeptical, and without thinking, you adjust. You soften your stance. You add qualifiers, I mean, maybe, or it's just a thought, but none of this feels like a problem. It feels like normal conversation, like being responsive, like being socially aware. But here's what's actually happening. Your thinking is being controlled by the other person's reactions. Every adjustment you make, every explanation you add, every clarification you offer is coming from a place of needing the interaction to go a certain way, needing to be understood, needing to be agreed with, needing to be seen as smart or capable or valuable. And that need is visible, not in an obvious way, but in the subtle signals you're sending, in the slight tension in your voice, in the extra energy you're putting into the conversation, in the way your attention is split between what you're saying and how they're receiving it. That's the pattern, and it's running in the background of almost every interaction you have. The question is, can you see it? Because once you do, everything changes. The reactive trap. Why your brain is sabotaging you. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. When was the last time you said something in a conversation and immediately wished you could take it back? Not because it was wrong, not because it was offensive, but because the moment it left your mouth, you felt it. That slight shift, that subtle change in the energy, that feeling of, that didn't land the way I wanted it to. Yeah, that feeling. Now here's the uncomfortable question. How often does that happen to you? If you're being honest, probably more than you'd like to admit. I know because I've been there. Hell, I used to live there. The story nobody tells. I need to tell you about a pattern I discovered in myself that was so uncomfortable to face, I almost didn't want to acknowledge it. But once I saw it, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was during a dinner party. Nothing fancy, just friends, good food, casual conversation, you know the vibe. And someone brought up a topic I actually knew a lot about, like genuinely knew my stuff. This was my area. So naturally, I started talking. I shared my perspective. I explained the nuances. I added context. I was being helpful, informative, engaging. At least that's what I thought I was doing. But about 3 minutes in, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. People's eyes. They weren't quite there. You know that look? When someone's physically present but mentally they've already moved on? Yeah, that look. And the worst part? I could feel myself trying harder to pull them back in, speaking faster, adding more details, throwing in a joke, anything to recapture that attention I'd somehow lost. It didn't work. The conversation shifted to something else, and I sat there feeling like I just failed a test I didn't know I was taking. Later that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop replaying it. What went wrong? I knew the subject. I wasn't rambling. I wasn't being boring. So why did I lose the room? That's when something clicked. Something that made me realize I'd been looking at this all wrong. The problem wasn't what I said. It was why I said it. The hidden motivation. Here's what I realized. I wasn't sharing information because I wanted to contribute to the conversation. I was sharing it because I wanted to be seen as knowledgeable. I wanted validation. I wanted people to think, wow, they really know their stuff. And that need, that subtle, barely conscious need for validation, it was leaking into everything. My tone, my energy, the way I structured my sentences, the way I kept talking, even when I should have stopped. People couldn't see the need consciously, but they could feel it, and that feeling changed how they received everything I said. This is the trap most people never escape, and it's so subtle, so normalized, that you don't even realize you're in it. You think you're just being conversational, just being engaged, just being a good communicator. But underneath, there's this constant scanning happening, this unconscious monitoring of how you're being received, and that monitoring is controlling everything you do. Let me break this down because it's crucial. The 3 levels of conversation. When you're talking to someone, there are actually 3 conversations happening simultaneously in your mind. Level 1, the content. This is what you're actually saying. The words, the information, the logical structure of your thoughts. This is the only level most people pay attention to. Level 2, the monitoring. This is where you're tracking how your words are being received. Are they listening? Do they look interested? Did that joke land? Should I explain more? This is happening constantly in the background, usually without you noticing. Level 3, the need. This is the deepest level. This is why you're saying what you're saying, what you're hoping to get from this interaction, what you need to happen for you to feel okay about yourself. And here's the thing, most people's level 3 is running the entire show without them realizing it. You think you're having a conversation about a topic, but really you're having a conversation about your need to be validated, understood, respected, or liked. And that need is shaping everything about how you communicate. I remember when I first became aware of all 3 levels operating at once. It was jarring. I was talking to a colleague about a project idea. Level 1 was the actual idea itself. But as I was explaining it, I became aware of level 2. I was watching their facial expressions, adjusting my explanation based on whether they seemed to be getting it, adding extra details when they looked confused, and then I noticed level 3. Underneath everything, I needed them to think the idea was good, not just good, but impressive. I needed them to see me as creative, as valuable, as someone worth listening to. And that need was making me over-explain. It was making me sell the idea harder than necessary. It was making me sound desperate, not obviously desperate, just subtly off. The moment I saw all 3 levels clearly, something shifted. I stopped mid-sentence, took a breath, and just let the idea stand on its own. The result? They actually engaged with it more, asked better questions, treated it more seriously, because I'd stopped needing them to validate it. Why this pattern keeps you stuck. Let me show you how this plays out in everyday situations, because once you see the pattern, you'll start recognizing it everywhere. Scenario 1, the disagreement. Someone disagrees with your point. Your immediate reaction? Explain more. Clarify your position. Make sure they understand what you really meant. Seems reasonable, right? You're just being clear. But watch what's actually happening. The moment they disagreed, your brain interpreted it as a threat to being right, a threat to being respected, a threat to your position in the conversation. So you react, fast, automatically, before you've even thought about whether a response is necessary. And in that reaction, you've already given away control, because now your state depends on whether they agree with you. Your sense of stability is tied to the outcome of this interaction. Scenario 2. The pause. You make a statement. There's a pause. Silence. For most people, that silence is unbearable. So what do? Fill it, add more context, repeat the point in different words. Anything to avoid that uncomfortable emptiness. But here's what's really happening. You're interpreting the silence as rejection, as confusion, as a sign that you weren't clear enough, interesting enough, valuable enough. So you react to that interpretation. You try to fix something that might not even be broken. Meanwhile, someone who's not operating from that reactive pattern, they let the silence exist. They're comfortable with it because their sense of stability doesn't depend on constant validation. Scenario 3. The interruption. Someone cuts you off mid-sentence. Your immediate feeling? Frustration, disrespect, the need to push back and finish your point. Again, seems normal. They interrupted you, you deserve to finish. But watch the underlying pattern. You're interpreting the interruption as a power move, as someone not respecting you. And that interpretation triggers a need to reclaim your position. So you react. Maybe you speak over them. Maybe you say, "Let me finish." Maybe you just get tighter, more tense, more forceful. And in doing that, you're proving exactly what they sensed, that you can be affected, that you can be pulled out of your center, that you're reactive. Someone who's not in that pattern, the interruption doesn't shake them, not because they're allowing disrespect, but because they're not interpreting it as a threat to their value, the cost you don't see. Here's what most people don't realize. Every time you react this way, you're training people how to treat you. When you over-explain after being challenged, you're teaching people that your position is uncertain, that you can be pushed. When you fill every silence, you're teaching people that your thoughts don't carry enough weight to sit in the space on their own. When you get visibly affected by interruptions, you're teaching people that you can be easily thrown off balance. None of this is conscious. They're not thinking, "Oh, this person is reactive, I can manipulate them." It's all happening at that second conversation level, the subtle, unconscious level where people are reading your internal state. And over time, these tiny moments compound into a reputation, a felt sense of who you are, not based on what you say, but based on how stable your thinking is underneath what you say. I learned this the hard way. There was a period in my life where I noticed something disturbing. People would bring ideas to me, ask for my input, value my perspective. But when it came to making actual decisions, I wasn't in the room. Not literally, I was physically there, but when the real choices were being made, when the power dynamics were being established, I somehow wasn't a factor. And I couldn't figure out why. I was smart, I was capable, I contributed valuable insights. So why was I being overlooked? Then I started paying attention to my patterns, and I saw it. Every time there was pressure, I reacted. Every time there was uncertainty, I tried to control it. Every time there was a challenge, I defended. I was sending a constant signal. I need things to go a certain way to feel stable. And people don't give power to someone whose stability depends on external conditions. They give power to people who stay grounded regardless of what's happening. That was a brutal realization, but it was also the beginning of everything changing. The deeper pattern. Now, here's where this gets really interesting, Because this reactive pattern isn't just about individual moments. It's about a fundamental way of processing reality. Most people's thinking is organized around avoiding discomfort, avoiding tension, avoiding uncertainty, avoiding the feeling of not being in control. So their entire mental framework becomes about managing those feelings. And the primary way they manage them is through reaction. Something creates tension, react to resolve it. Something creates uncertainty, react to get clarity. Something threatens your position, react to defend it. It feels productive. It feels like you're handling things. It feels like you're engaged and responsive. But what's actually happening is you're being controlled by your need for comfort, your need for certainty, your need for validation. And that need is running your entire life without you realizing it. Think about it. How many of your daily decisions are actually choices, and how many are just reactions to avoid discomfort? You check your phone constantly. Why? Because the uncertainty of not knowing creates discomfort. You over-explain your decisions to others. Why? Because the possibility of being misunderstood creates discomfort. You avoid difficult conversations. Why? Because the tension they might create is uncomfortable. You need people to agree with you. Why? Because disagreement challenges your sense of being right, which is uncomfortable. The pattern is everywhere, and it's keeping you in a reactive state that prevents you from ever developing real presence, real influence, real control. The shift that changes everything. So how do you break this pattern? Not by trying to stop reacting. That's still reactive thinking. That's still trying to control your behavior from a place of need. The shift happens deeper. It happens when you change what you're optimizing for. Right now, whether you know it or not, you're optimizing for comfort, for certainty, for validation, for having things go a certain way, but high-value thinking optimizes for something completely different. It optimizes for clarity, for truth, for alignment with reality as it actually is, not as you wish it were. And when you make that shift, reactions start to fall away naturally, not because you're suppressing them, but because the need driving them isn't there anymore. Let me give you an example of what this looks like in practice. A few months after I started working on this, I was in a situation that would have previously made me spiral. Someone publicly criticized an idea I'd shared, not aggressively, but clearly, in front of other people. Old me would have immediately jumped to defend it, to explain what they misunderstood, to clarify my position, to make sure everyone knew the criticism wasn't valid. But this time, something different happened. I felt the impulse to react. I noticed it. And then I asked myself a different question. Is this criticism actually valid? Not, how do I defend myself? Not, what will people think if I don't respond? Just, is there truth in what they're saying? And you know what? There was. Not in everything, but in part of it. They'd pointed out a genuine weakness in the idea that I hadn't considered. So instead of defending, I said something that would have been impossible for old me. You know what? You're right about that. I hadn't thought of it from that angle. The room went quiet because people aren't used to that. They're used to defensiveness, to explanations, to people protecting their position. But what happened next was fascinating. The entire dynamic shifted. The conversation became collaborative instead of combative. People started building on the idea instead of poking holes in it. My credibility went up, not down, because I wasn't reacting from a need to be right. I was responding from a place of wanting to find what was actually true. That's the difference, and it changes everything. What you need to understand, this reactive pattern you're stuck in, it's not a personality flaw. It's not weakness. It's not something wrong with you. It's just a learned behavior, a way of thinking that got wired into you through years of social conditioning. Through every time you got rewarded for pleasing others. Through every time you got punished for standing out. Through every time you learned that being liked was more important than being authentic. But here's the good news. If it's learned, it can be unlearned, not overnight, not through some magic technique, but through consistent awareness, through catching yourself in the pattern, through making different choices, one interaction at a time. And the first step is simply seeing the pattern clearly, seeing how often you're reacting instead of choosing, seeing how much of your thinking is organized around avoiding discomfort rather than seeking truth. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that awareness is the beginning of freedom. But there's still a piece missing, because understanding the problem intellectually isn't enough. You need to understand what to replace it with. You need to see what non-reactive thinking actually looks like in practice. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next. The architecture of unshakable thinking. Okay, so we've established that most people are stuck in reactive mode. We've seen how that pattern quietly sabotages everything. Now comes the part that actually changes your life. What does non-reactive thinking actually look like? Not in theory, not in some abstract philosophical sense, but in real, messy, everyday situations where pressure is building and your instincts are screaming at you to react. I'm going to show you. But first, I need to tell you about a moment that completely shifted how I understood all of this. The conversation that changed everything. It was a Friday evening, and I was having drinks with an old friend. We'll call him Marcus. Now, Marcus is one of those people who just commands respect. Not in an aggressive way, not in a loud way. He's actually pretty quiet most of the time. But when he's in a room, you feel it. And I had always wondered what made him different. So that night, after a couple of drinks, loosened us up. I asked him directly, Marcus, how do you do it? How do you stay so unaffected by everything? He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. I don't try to stay unaffected. I just don't see situations the same way you do. I must have looked confused because he laughed and continued. Most people look at a situation and immediately ask, how does this affect me? What do I need to do? What's the right response? Their entire focus is on themselves and their reaction. But I ask different questions. Like what? I leaned in. Like, what's actually happening here, independent of how I feel about it? What am I not seeing? What's beneath the surface? I'm not trying to control the situation. I'm trying to understand it first, and that changes everything. I sat there, processing. It seemed so simple, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how radically different that approach was from how I'd been operating my entire life. Marcus wasn't trying to manage situations. He wasn't trying to control outcomes. He wasn't even trying to control himself, really. He was just observing clearly without the filter of his ego getting in the way, and from that place of observation, his responses naturally became different, calmer, more precise, more powerful. That conversation planted a seed, and over the next few months, I started experimenting with this approach. And what I discovered changed everything. The 3 pillars of high-value thinking. Through a lot of trial and error, a lot of uncomfortable self-awareness, and a lot of situations where I fell flat on my face, I started to see a pattern. High-value thinking isn't one thing. It's a combination of 3 interconnected ways of processing reality. I call them the 3 pillars: separation, expansion, and detachment. Let me break each one down in a way you can actually use. Pillar 1, separation. What's mine versus what's not. This is the foundation. Everything else builds on. And it's deceptively simple. In any situation, there are things within your control and things outside your control. But here's the trick. Most people don't actually separate these clearly. They get them all tangled up, and that tangling creates constant stress and reactivity. Let me give you a real example from my own life. A few months back, I sent an important email to a potential client. It was well written, clear, addressed their needs. I hit send feeling good about it. Then, nothing. Days went by. No response. Old me would have spiraled. I would have checked my email constantly. I would have drafted follow-up messages in my head. I would have wondered what I did wrong. I would have created entire narratives about why they weren't responding. All of that mental activity would have been focused on something completely outside my control, their response. But I'd been practicing this separation technique. So instead I asked myself, what's actually mine in this situation? The answer was clear. The quality of my email was mine. The decision to follow up or not was mine. How I spent my time while waiting was mine. My emotional state was mine. Their response, not mine. Their timeline, not mine. Their internal decision-making process, not mine. Sounds obvious, right? But watch what happens when you actually practice this. The moment I made that separation clear, all the anxiety vanished. Not because I stopped caring about the outcome, but because I stopped trying to control something that was never mine to control in the first place. My energy went back to things I could actually affect. I worked on other projects. I improved my pitch for the next potential client. I stayed productive and clear-headed. And you know what? They eventually responded. 3 weeks later, loved the proposal, signed on. But here's the key. Whether they responded or not, my state remained stable because my state wasn't dependent on their action. That's the power of separation. Now, let's go deeper, because this applies to every interaction you have. Someone criticizes you. What's yours? How you interpret that criticism, whether you extract something useful from it, how you respond, or whether you respond at all. What's not yours? Their opinion, their tone, their motivation for saying it. Someone doesn't laugh at your joke. What's yours? Whether you let that affect your confidence. What's not yours? Their sense of humor, their mood, whether they found it funny. Someone interrupts you. What's yours? Whether you let it destabilize you, how you handle it. What's not yours? Their behavior, their awareness, their respect level in that moment. See the pattern? Most people's thinking is constantly bleeding into the not yours category. They're trying to control things they can't control. And that attempt creates a constant state of low-level stress that leaks into everything. But when you practice separation, when you get really clear about what's actually yours, something magical happens. You become unshakable, not because nothing bothers you, but because you're no longer trying to control the uncontrollable. I remember the first time I really felt this difference. I was in a heated discussion with a colleague. Different visions for a project, both passionate about our perspectives. Old me would have been completely invested in convincing them. My entire state would have depended on whether I won the argument. But this time, I separated it out. What was mine? Expressing my perspective clearly, understanding their perspective fully, making the best decision for the project based on available information. What wasn't mine? Whether they agreed with me, whether they changed their mind, whether they liked my idea. And from that place of separation, the entire interaction changed. I didn't get defensive when they pushed back. I didn't feel the need to over-explain when they seemed skeptical. I just presented my case and listened to theirs. The conversation became collaborative instead of combative. And even though we didn't end up going with my exact proposal, we found a better solution that incorporated elements from both perspectives. More importantly, I left that conversation feeling energized instead of drained, because I hadn't been fighting to control something outside my control. That's pillar one. Master this, and you're already ahead of 90% of people. Pillar two, expansion. Time changes everything. This one's subtle, but incredibly powerful. Most reactive thinking operates in a very narrow time frame. It's focused on the immediate moment. What do I do right now? How do I handle this situation right now? What's the best response right now? That immediacy creates urgency, and urgency creates pressure, and pressure creates reactive behavior. But high-value thinking expands the time frame. It zooms out. It asks, what does this moment mean in the context of the next week? The next month? The next year? And that expansion completely changes your response. Let me show you what I mean. A few years ago, someone said something dismissive about my work in a public setting. Not aggressive, just casually dismissive. In front of people whose opinions mattered to me. My immediate reaction, a hot flash of anger, the urge to correct them, to defend my work, to make sure everyone knew they were wrong. That's short-term thinking. That's the immediate moment demanding a response. But I'd been practicing expansion. So I asked myself, will this matter tomorrow, next week, next year? And the answer was obvious. No. This was a throwaway comment from someone having a bad day. In the grand scheme of things, it was meaningless. But if I reacted defensively in that moment, that would matter. That would create awkwardness. That would make me look insecure. That would be remembered far longer than the original comment. So I didn't react. I let it pass. Acknowledged it with a simple, interesting perspective, and moved on. And you know what happened? Nothing. The moment dissolved. Life continued, and that person actually came up to me later and apologized, said they were stressed, and took it out on me. If I'd reacted in the moment, we'd have had a conflict. Instead, we had a moment of connection. That's the power of expansion. But it goes deeper than just avoiding conflicts. Expansion changes how you see opportunities, relationships, setbacks, everything. I had a business opportunity fall through recently, a partnership that seemed perfect. We were 90% of the way there, and then it collapsed. Funding issues on their end. Short-term thinking says, this is a disaster. I wasted months on this. What do I do now? Expanded thinking says, what did I learn from this process? What connections did I make? What skills did I develop? How does this change my strategy moving forward? And from that expanded perspective, I could see clearly. The partnership falling through was actually a blessing. It forced me to develop capabilities I wouldn't have otherwise. It introduced me to people who became valuable in other ways. It revealed weaknesses in my approach that I could now address. 6 months later, I landed a better opportunity that I wouldn't have been ready for if the first one had worked out. But I only saw that because I was thinking in expanded time frames. Here's how to practice this. Next time you feel pressured to respond to something immediately, pause. Ask yourself, will this matter in 24 hours, in a week, in a month? If the answer is no, don't give it the weight of something that will matter in a month. Let it be what it actually is, a momentary blip. If the answer is yes, then ask, what response will my future self be glad I made? That question alone changes everything, because your future self doesn't care about defending your ego in the moment. Your future self cares about the consequences of your actions. I started applying this to everything. Arguments with my partner, difficult decisions at work, conflicts with friends, even social media interactions. And consistently, the answer from expanded thinking was different from the answer from immediate thinking. Immediate thinking wants to be right now. Expanded thinking wants to be effective over time. Immediate thinking wants to win the argument. Expanded thinking wants to preserve the relationship. Immediate thinking wants to defend the position. Expanded thinking wants to find the truth. And that difference is everything. Pillar 3, detachment, the freedom of not needing. This is the one that confused me the most at first, because when people hear detachment, they think it means not caring, being cold, being distant. But that's not what this is at all. Detachment means you're not emotionally controlled by outcomes. It means you can engage fully with something without needing it to go a certain way. There's a massive difference. Let me tell you about a moment when I finally understood this. I was given a presentation to a group of investors. High stakes, a lot riding on this. And I'd prepared extensively. I knew my material. I believed in what I was presenting. Old me would have walked into that room needing them to say yes, needing them to be impressed, needing validation that my idea was good. And that need would have leaked into everything. My tone would have been slightly too eager. My responses to their questions would have been defensive. My energy would have been focused on convincing rather than communicating. But I've been working on detachment. So I walked in with a different frame. I believe in this. I'm going to present it as clearly as I can. If it resonates with them, great. If it doesn't, that's information. Either way, I'll be fine. Notice the difference? I was still fully engaged, still passionate, still wanted a positive outcome, but I wasn't attached to needing that outcome to feel okay about myself. And that changed everything about how I showed up. I presented with clarity instead of urgency. When they pushed back on certain points, I didn't get defensive. I genuinely considered their concerns. When they asked hard questions, I didn't scramble to have perfect answers. I acknowledged what I didn't know and explained how I'd address it. And the result? They invested. But more importantly, the entire interaction felt clean. There was no desperation, no manipulation, no trying to force an outcome, just clear communication from a grounded place. That's detachment in action. Now, here's where people get this wrong. They think detachment means not caring about the outcome. But that's not it. You can care deeply about something and still be detached from needing it. Think about the best teachers you've ever had. They cared deeply about their students' learning, but they weren't attached to every student having a breakthrough in every class. They presented the material clearly, created space for learning, and then let each student take what they needed. That's detachment. Caring deeply, but not needing to control the outcome. Or think about great artists. They pour themselves into their work. But the best ones aren't attached to everyone loving it. They create from a genuine place and let the work find its audience. I started practicing this in smaller, everyday situations, sharing an opinion in a group conversation without needing everyone to agree, just stating what I saw clearly and letting it land however it landed, making plans with friends without being attached to them saying yes, offering the invitation genuinely and being equally okay with a yes or a no, helping someone with advice without being attached to whether they took it, sharing what I knew and trusting them to make their own choices. And every single time I practiced this, I felt lighter because I wasn't carrying the weight of needing a specific outcome. I was just showing up authentically and letting reality unfold. But here's the deepest part of detachment, the part that took me the longest to understand. You can only truly influence something when you're not attached to influencing it. I know that sounds paradoxical, but it's true. When you need someone to agree with you, they feel that need, and that need makes them resist. But when you genuinely don't need them to agree, when you're just presenting your perspective clearly, they're free to actually consider it. When you need a situation to go a certain way, you're tense. You're controlling. You're not seeing clearly. But when you're detached from the outcome, you're relaxed. You're open. You can respond to what's actually happening instead of what you need to happen. I saw this most clearly in my relationships. I used to need my partner to respond to me in certain ways, to validate my feelings, to agree with my perspective, to make me feel heard. And that need created constant friction because she could feel it, and nobody wants to be needed that way. It feels like pressure. But when I started practicing detachment, when I could express my feelings without needing her to respond in a specific way, everything changed. I could say, "I'm feeling frustrated about this," without needing her to fix it or agree with me or even fully understand it. I was just expressing what was true for me and giving her space to respond however she needed to. And from that place, she could actually hear me. We could have real conversations instead of subtle power struggles. That's the magic of detachment. It removes the pressure from every interaction. And when there's no pressure, there's space for genuine connection, for real influence, for authentic communication. How these three pillars work together. Here's what's beautiful about these three pillars. They reinforce each other. Separation gives you clarity about what's actually yours to control. Expansion gives you perspective on what actually matters. Detachment gives you freedom from needing specific outcomes. And together, they create something remarkable, unshakable thinking, not because you're rigid or stubborn or closed off, but because your internal state isn't being controlled by external events. Let me show you what this looks like when all three work together. Last month, I had a situation that would have absolutely wrecked old me. A major project I'd been working on for 6 months got canceled. Budget cuts. Nothing personal, just business. Immediately, I felt a hit. Disappointment, frustration, a flash of, what now? But then the three pillars kicked in automatically. Separation. What's mine here? My response to this news? How I spend the energy I was putting into that project? What I learned from the experience? What's not mine? The decision to cancel. The budget situation. The company's priorities. Expansion. Will this matter in a year? How I respond will matter. But a project being canceled? Probably not. What opportunity does this create that I can't see yet? Detachment. I wanted this project to succeed, but I don't need it to have succeeded for me to be okay. I gave it my best effort. The outcome is what it is. And from that place, from those three pillars working together, I could respond clearly. I thanked the team for the opportunity. I documented what I'd learned. I redirected my energy into other projects that had been on the back burner. And within 2 weeks, one of those back burner projects led to something bigger than the canceled project would have been. But I only got there because I didn't waste energy reacting from a place of need, fear, or attachment. The practice now. I know what you're thinking. This sounds great in theory, but how do I actually do this when I'm in the middle of a tense situation and my emotions are running high? Fair question. Because understanding these pillars intellectually is one thing. Having them operate automatically under pressure is something else entirely. Here's what worked for me. I started small, really small. I didn't try to apply this to the biggest, most emotionally charged situations in my life. I practiced on low-stakes moments. Someone cut me off in traffic. Instead of getting angry, I practiced separation. Their driving is not mine. My response is. A friend canceled plans. Instead of taking it personally, I practiced detachment. I wanted to hang out, but I don't need them to be available for me to be okay. A minor setback at work. Instead of spiraling, I practiced expansion. Will this matter next week? And slowly, through consistent practice in these smaller moments, the pillars became automatic. They became my default way of processing situations. So when the bigger moments came, the high-stakes interactions, the emotionally charged conflicts, I didn't have to think about it. The pillars were already there, operating in the background. That's the key. You can't build this mental architecture in the moment you need it. You build it through consistent practice in moments you don't need it. And over time, it becomes who you are. What changes when these three pillars become your default way of thinking? Everything changes. Not overnight, not in some dramatic transformation, but gradually, consistently, noticeably. People start treating you differently, not because you're trying to command respect, but because your thinking has changed the signals you send. You interrupt people less because you're not rushing to react. You listen more because you're not just waiting for your turn to speak. You stay calmer in tense situations because you separated what's yours from what's not. You make better decisions because you're thinking in expanded time frames instead of immediate reactions. You see opportunities others miss because you're not clouded by attachment to specific outcomes. Your relationships improve because you can engage without needing constant validation. Your work improves because you can focus on quality instead of controlling how it's received. And most importantly, you feel different, lighter, clearer, more grounded, not because your life got easier, but because your thinking changed how you experience your life. That's the promise of these 3 pillars. Not that external circumstances will always go your way, but that regardless of external circumstances, you'll stay steady. And from that steadiness, you become someone who naturally commands respect, naturally influences others, naturally creates the life you want. Not through force, through presence. But there's still something we need to address. Because even with these pillars in place, there's one trap that catches almost everyone. One pattern that can undo all of this if you're not aware of it. And we're going to dive into that next. The invisible chains. Why seeking approval is killing your power. Let me tell you about the most dangerous addiction you don't know you have. It's not drugs. It's not alcohol. It's not your phone, although that's close. It's approval. And before you say, "That's not me, I don't care what people think," let me stop you right there. Because that's exactly what I used to tell myself. And I was completely wrong. The need for approval is so deeply wired into how we operate, so normalized by society, so disguised as being a good person or being socially intelligent, that most people never even recognize it as the prison it actually is. But it is a prison, and it's quietly controlling almost every decision you make, every word you speak, every interaction you have. I'm going to show you exactly how. And fair warning, this is going to be uncomfortable, because once you see this pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And you're going to realize how much of your life has been spent performing for an audience that doesn't even exist. The day I saw the cage, I need to tell you about a specific Thursday afternoon that broke something open in me. I was at a coffee shop working on my laptop. Standard Thursday, nothing special. And I overheard a conversation at the next table. 2 women, probably in their 30s, catching up over coffee. One of them was talking about a decision she'd made. I don't remember what the decision was, but I remember exactly what she said about it. I know it's what I want to do, but I just keep thinking about what everyone will think. What if they judge me? What if they think I'm making a mistake? And her friend, trying to be supportive, said, "Who cares what they think? You have to do what's right for you." And the first woman nodded. "You're right. I know you're right. But I just can't stop thinking about it." I sat there pretending to work on my laptop, but really, I was frozen. Because I'd had that exact same conversation with myself 1,000 times. And in that moment, I saw something that made my stomach turn. She wasn't actually asking whether she should care what others think. She'd already decided that she cared, that caring was non-negotiable. Her entire thought process was happening within the frame of needing approval. The question wasn't, what do I actually want? It was, how do I get what I want while also maintaining everyone's approval. And that's an impossible equation because those two things are often in direct conflict. But here's the really disturbing part. I realized I was doing the exact same thing every single day in ways I hadn't even noticed. Let me show you what I mean. The approval tax. There's a cost to everything you do. Time, energy, money, whatever. But there's another cost most people never calculate. The approval tax. It's the extra energy you spend worrying about how your actions will be perceived. The mental bandwidth consumed by imagining what others might think. The emotional labor of managing everyone's potential reactions. And for most people, this tax is massive. It's taken up 30, 40, sometimes 50% of their mental resources at any given moment. Think about it. Really think about it. How much of your day is spent crafting messages to sound a certain way, choosing words that won't offend anyone, avoiding topics that might create disagreement, softening your opinions to be more palatable, second-guessing decisions based on imagined judgments, explaining yourself to people who didn't even ask. All of that is the approval tax, and you're paying it constantly without even realizing it. I started tracking this in my own life, and I was horrified by what I found. I'd spend 20 minutes crafting a simple email because I was trying to strike the perfect tone. Not too casual, not too formal, not too eager, not too distant, not too direct, not too vague. I'd rehearse conversations in my head before having them, planning out what I'd say and how I'd say it to get the best possible reaction. I'd avoid sharing certain opinions in group settings because I didn't want to be the one who created tension. I'd agreed to things I didn't want to do because saying no felt uncomfortable. All of this felt normal. It felt like being considerate, being socially aware, being a good communicator. But it wasn't. It was me trying to control how others perceived me. And that attempt at control was costing me everything. The 3 masks we wear. Here's how the approval addiction actually works. It's subtle, it's insidious, and it operates through 3 primary masks that we wear without even knowing it. Mask 1, the people pleaser. This is the most obvious one. The person who can't say no, who always agrees, who bends over backward to make others happy. But here's what most people miss. People pleasing isn't about being nice. It's about fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of not being liked. Fear of being seen as difficult or demanding or selfish. So, instead, you become agreeable, accommodating, easy to deal with. And on the surface, this seems like a good strategy. People like you. You avoid conflict. Everything stays smooth. But underneath, something toxic is happening. You're training people that your needs don't matter, that your boundaries are flexible, that they can take from you without giving back. And worse, you're training yourself that your own desires are secondary to keeping others happy. I lived in this mask for years, and I didn't even realize it was a mask because I'd convinced myself it was just being a good person. I'd say yes to plans I didn't want to make. I'd help people even when I was already overwhelmed. I'd prioritize others' needs over my own consistently. And you know what I got for it? Not respect. Not genuine appreciation. Not deep connections. I got taken for granted. Because here's the thing about people pleasing. It doesn't create respect. It creates an imbalance. And imbalanced relationships are never healthy, never sustainable, never fulfilling. But the mask was so comfortable, so socially rewarded, that I kept wearing it long after it stopped serving me. Mask 2. The performer. This mask is more subtle. It's the person who's always on, always optimized for how they're being perceived, always managing their image. These are the people who post on social media constantly to maintain their brand, tell stories in social settings that position them in a certain light, name drop and humble brag to elevate their status, carefully curate which parts of themselves they show to which people. And again, this doesn't feel like approval seeking. It feels like personal branding, like being strategic, like putting your best foot forward. But underneath, it's exhausting because you're constantly monitoring how you're being received, constantly adjusting based on feedback, constantly performing instead of just being. I remember a period where I was deeply in this mask. Every social interaction felt like an audition. Every conversation felt like an opportunity to demonstrate my value. I'd tell stories not because I wanted to share an experience, but because I wanted people to see me as interesting, successful, accomplished. I'd drop references to impressive things I'd done, people I'd met, places I'd been, all casual, all subtle, but all designed to shape how others perceived me. And the crazy part? It worked. People were impressed. They saw me as successful, accomplished, well-connected. But I felt hollow, because none of it was real connection. It was all performance. And performance requires an audience. And needing an audience means you're never free. Mask 3. The validator. This is the most insidious mask, because it disguises itself as empathy. The validator is always affirming others, always supportive, always agreeing, never challenging, never pushing back, never offering a perspective that might create tension. On the surface, this looks like emotional intelligence, like being a good friend, like being supportive and understanding, but really, it's another form of approval seeking. Because by constantly validating others, you're ensuring they'll like you. You're avoiding any risk of conflict or disagreement that might threaten your connection. I fell into this trap with friendships. I'd listen to friends complain about the same problems repeatedly, and instead of offering honest perspective or challenging their thinking, I'd just agree. Yeah, that person sounds terrible. You're totally right to feel that way. They don't deserve you. And my friends would feel heard. They'd feel supported. They'd like me for being such a good listener. But I wasn't actually helping them. I was just reinforcing whatever they already believed, so they continued to see me positively. Real friendship requires honesty. It requires being willing to say difficult things when they need to be said. It requires caring more about someone's growth than their approval. But that's risky, because honesty can create tension, and tension threatens approval. So instead, I stayed in the validator mask, safe, liked, completely inauthentic. The moment it all broke, about 8 months ago, something happened that shattered all 3 masks at once. I was at a dinner party with some friends. The conversation turned to a topic I had strong opinions about, something I'd thought about deeply, something I actually knew quite a bit about. But as people started sharing their perspectives, I noticed something happening inside me. I was calibrating, adjusting, trying to figure out which opinion would be most acceptable to the group. I could feel myself sliding into the familiar patterns. People pleaser. Don't say anything that might create disagreement. Performer. If I do speak, make sure it sounds intelligent and well-reasoned. Validator. Agree with whatever the dominant opinion is to maintain social harmony. And I was about to do exactly that. About to offer some watered-down, carefully calibrated opinion that wouldn't offend anyone. But then something inside me just snapped. I don't know if it was frustration or exhaustion or just a sudden clarity, but I thought, what the hell am I doing? I wasn't even being myself. I was being some weird composite of what I thought everyone at that table wanted me to be. So I took a breath, and I said what I actually thought, not aggressively, not trying to be provocative, just honestly. And you know what happened? Some people agreed, some people disagreed, some people asked questions. We had an actual conversation with real substance instead of polite surface-level agreement. And at the end of it, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, real, not liked by everyone, not impressive, not perfectly calibrated, just real. And that feeling was so much better than approval, it wasn't even close. The cost of the masks. Here's what I realized in the weeks after that dinner party. The approval addiction had been costing me everything that actually matters. It cost me authenticity. When you're constantly adjusting yourself based on who's watching, you lose touch with who you actually are. Your personality becomes this fluid, shifting thing that changes based on context. And eventually, you don't even know what you genuinely think or feel anymore. It cost me deep connections. When you're wearing masks, people can't actually know you. They can know the version you're presenting, but that's not you. So your relationships stay surface level, pleasant but not deep, comfortable but not meaningful. It cost me respect. This is the ironic part. I was seeking approval because I wanted respect. But the very act of seeking approval communicated that I didn't respect myself enough to stand on my own. And people pick up on that. They don't respect people who desperately need their approval. It cost me power. Every time you adjust yourself based on others' reactions, you give them power over you. You make your internal state dependent on their external response, and that dependency is the opposite of power. It cost me energy, the mental and emotional labor of constantly managing perception is exhausting. It's like running a background program on your computer that's constantly eating up processing power. You have less energy for everything else because so much is going toward maintaining the masks. And here's the kicker. All of that cost was for something that doesn't even exist. Because the approval you're seeking, it's never enough. It's never stable. It's never secure. You can have a room full of people validating you, and one person's skeptical look will undo all of it. You can get praised for something, and you'll immediately worry about whether you can maintain that standard. You can be liked by everyone, and you'll still feel empty because deep down, you know they don't actually know you. It's an unwinnable game, and the only way to win is to stop playing. The approval paradox. Here's something that blew my mind when I finally understood it. The less you seek approval, the more you get it. Not because you're trying to get it through reverse psychology, but because when you stop needing it, you become someone worth approving of. Let me explain. When you need approval, you send out subtle signals of neediness, of uncertainty, of dependence, and people naturally pull back from that energy. It feels like pressure. It feels draining. But when you don't need approval, When you're genuinely okay with or without it, you send out completely different signals. Signals of self-assurance, of groundedness, of stability, and people are naturally drawn to that, not because you're trying to attract them, but because stable energy is rare and valuable. I saw this play out in my own life in the months after I started dropping the masks. I stopped over-explaining myself. If someone didn't understand my perspective, I didn't chase their understanding. I just let it be. I stopped agreeing with things I didn't actually agree with. If I had a different opinion, I shared it calmly, without needing anyone to agree with me. I stopped performing. I stopped trying to impress. I just showed up as I actually was, flaws and all. And something amazing happened. People started respecting me more, not less, more. My friendships got deeper because they were based on reality instead of performance. My professional relationships got stronger because people knew they were getting my actual thoughts, not calibrated versions designed to please them. Even my romantic relationship transformed because I stopped trying to be what I thought my partner wanted and just was myself. And that authenticity created intimacy that no amount of people-pleasing ever could have. How the pattern actually works. Let me break down the mechanics of how approval-seeking actually operates, because once you see the mechanism clearly, you can interrupt it. Step 1. The trigger. Something happens that creates uncertainty about how you're being perceived. Someone doesn't laugh at your joke. Someone seems skeptical of your idea. Someone doesn't respond to your message right away. Step 2. The interpretation. Your brain immediately interprets this as a threat, not a physical threat, but a social one. They don't approve of me. They don't like me. I'm losing status. Step 3. The need. This interpretation triggers a need to fix it, to regain approval, to restore the sense that you're liked, respected, valued. Step 4. The adjustment. You adjust your behavior to try to get back to approval. You explain more. You soften your stance. You agree more readily. You perform harder. Step 5. The temporary relief. If your adjustment works, you get temporary validation. They laugh. They agree. They respond positively, and you feel relief. Step 6. The dependency. But that relief isn't freedom. It's another hit of the drug. And now you're more dependent on external validation than you were before, because you've reinforced the pattern that your emotional state depends on others' approval. And the cycle continues, getting stronger each time, getting more automatic, until it's running your entire life without you even noticing. The way to break this isn't to skip the adjustment step and force yourself to not react. That's still operating within the same framework. The way to break it is to change step 2, the interpretation. The reframe that changes everything. Instead of interpreting uncertainty about perception as a threat, what if you interpreted it as nothing, just information, just data, not a threat, not a validation, just neutral reality? Someone doesn't laugh at your joke. That's information about their sense of humor, their mood, their attention level. It's not information about your value as a person. Someone seems skeptical of your idea. That's information about their perspective, their experience, their concerns. It's not information about whether your idea is good or whether you're smart. Someone doesn't respond to your message. That's information about their availability, their priorities, their phone habits. It's not information about whether they like you. This reframe sounds simple, but it's revolutionary because when you stop interpreting normal human variation as threats to your value, you stop needing to defend your value constantly. You stop adjusting. You stop performing. You stop wearing masks. You just are. And from that place, something incredible happens. You become magnetic, not because you're trying to be, but because groundedness is inherently attractive. People want to be around people who aren't performing, who aren't needy, who aren't constantly adjusting based on feedback, who are just solid. That's the paradox. The approval you've been chasing your whole life becomes available the moment you stop chasing it. My 30-day experiment. About 4 months ago, I decided to run an experiment. For 30 days, I would practice one simple rule. Say and do only what feels authentic, regardless of how it might be received. Not what felt good, not what I thought people wanted to hear. What felt authentic. What actually represented my genuine thoughts, feelings, and preferences. The first few days were terrifying. Every interaction felt risky. Every honest statement felt like I was about to be judged or rejected or disliked. I said no to plans I didn't want to make. I shared opinions that I knew some people would disagree with. I stopped validating complaints I didn't actually think were valid. I stopped performing competence and just admitted when I didn't know something. And you know what happened? Some people didn't like it. A few acquaintances drifted away. Some people seemed surprised or confused by the shift. But the people who mattered? The people who were actually important in my life? Our relationships got stronger, deeper, more real, because they were finally getting to know the actual me, not the version I'd been performing. And more importantly, I felt free. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I felt like I wasn't carrying this invisible weight of managing everyone's perception of me. Conversations became easier because I wasn't calculating every word. Decisions became clearer because I wasn't filtering them through what will people think. Interactions became more enjoyable because I wasn't monitoring them constantly. By the end of the 30 days, I realized something profound. I'd been in prison my entire life, a prison made of imagined judgments and anticipated reactions. And the door had never actually been locked. I just hadn't thought to try opening it. The 3 keys to freedom. Through this process, I discovered 3 specific practices that made the biggest difference in breaking free from approval seeking. Key 1. The honest. No practice saying no. Without justification, not rudely, just clearly. Someone invites you to something you don't want to do? Thanks for thinking of me, but I'll pass. No elaborate excuse, no apology, no justification, just a clear, honest no. This is terrifying at first because we're trained to believe we owe people explanations. That saying no requires a good reason that they'll accept. But you don't. Your preference is enough. Your time is yours. Your energy is yours. And you don't need anyone's permission to prioritize yourself. I started practicing this with small things. Turning down invitations. Declining requests that didn't align with my priorities. Setting boundaries that felt important to me. And what I discovered, most people respected it more than the elaborate excuses I used to give. Because a clear no is actually easier to receive than a wishy-washy maybe or an excuse that sounds fake. Key 2. The undefended statement practice, stating your perspective without defending it preemptively. Old me would say, I think we should go with option A, and here's why. Although I could be wrong, and I see the merit in option B, so I'm open to other perspectives, just sharing my thoughts. That's not a statement. That's a defended position that's already retreating before anyone's even challenged it. New me says, I think we should go with option A, and then stops and waits to see if anyone has questions or disagreements. If they do, I can address them. But I don't defend against imaginary objections before they even appear. This simple shift changed how people received my ideas. Because when you don't defend something preemptively, it doesn't look like it needs defending. It looks like a solid position held by someone who's confident in their thinking. Key 3, the comfortable silence practice, letting silence exist without filling it. This was maybe the hardest one for me, because silence in conversation used to feel like failure, like something had gone wrong, like I needed to fix it, so I'd fill it with clarifications, with additional points, with nervous chatter. But I started practicing just letting it sit, making a point and then stopping. Even if there was silence, even if people were thinking, even if it felt awkward. And what I discovered, that silence was never as uncomfortable for others as it was for me. Often they were just processing, thinking, formulating a response. And by filling the silence, I was actually interrupting their process. I was communicating that I didn't trust my point to stand on its own. But when I let it sit, when I gave it space, it carried more weight. People took it more seriously. They had time to actually consider it, instead of just waiting for me to finish talking. What's possible on the other side? Here's what I want you to understand. This isn't about becoming some cold, detached person who doesn't care about anyone. It's not about being selfish or inconsiderate or rude. It's about being free. Free to show up as you actually are. Free to express what you actually think. Free to make choices based on what actually matters to you, not what you think others want from you. And from that freedom, something beautiful becomes possible. Genuine connection. Because when you're not performing, people can actually know you. When you're not people-pleasing, your relationships can be balanced. When you're not seeking approval, you can receive real respect. That's what's waiting on the other side of this approval addiction. Not isolation, not conflict, not rejection. Just the ability to be yourself, fully, without apology, without adjustment, without the exhausting labor of constant perception management. And when you get there, when you really feel what it's like to interact with the world from that grounded place, you'll wonder how you ever lived any other way. But there's still one more piece to this puzzle. Because even when you understand all of this intellectually, even when you know the approval trap is limiting you, there are still moments where you slip back into old patterns. Moments where the pressure builds and your instinct is to react, to adjust, to perform. And what you do in those moments determines everything. That's what we're going to explore next. The crucible moments, where everything you've learned gets tested. There's a specific type of moment that reveals everything about who you really are. Not the big dramatic moments, not the life-changing decisions, not the carefully planned interactions where you have time to think and prepare. I'm talking about the small, unexpected moments where pressure appears out of nowhere and your brain wants to react right now. Someone says something that hits a nerve. A situation shifts in a way you didn't expect. A comment lands wrong. A look feels dismissive. A silence stretches too long. And in that moment, in that split second before you respond, everything hangs in the balance. This is where theory meets reality, where understanding meets practice, where knowing what you should do crashes into the visceral urge to do something else entirely. And here's the brutal truth. Most people fail this test every single time, not because they don't know better, but because knowing better doesn't mean anything when your nervous system is hijacked by perceived threat. I'm going to show you what's actually happening in these moments, and more importantly, I'm going to show you how to pass the test when it matters most. The moment that exposed everything. Let me take you back to a Tuesday morning about 7 months ago. I was in a video conference with a potential partner. Important meeting. We'd been building this relationship for weeks, getting close to finalizing a collaboration that could significantly impact my business. The conversation was going well, professional, productive. We were aligned on most points. And then he said something that made my stomach drop. I'm just not sure you have the bandwidth to really deliver on this. From what I've seen, you seem pretty stretched already. Now, objectively, this was a legitimate concern, a reasonable question, something we should definitely discuss. But the way it landed in my body, like a punch to the gut. Because what I heard wasn't the question. What I heard was, you're not capable. You're not professional enough. You're not enough. And immediately, I felt it. That familiar surge, the urge to defend, to explain, to prove him wrong, to list everything I was working on and how I was managing it all perfectly. Thank you very much. Every fiber of my being wanted to react right now, to correct this misperception before it solidified into his actual opinion of me. And old me would have done exactly that, would have jumped in with a detailed explanation of my capacity, my systems, my track record, would have turned a simple question into a defensive dissertation. But I'd been practicing something different, something uncomfortable, something that went against every instinct I had in that moment. I paused, not for long, maybe 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, everything changed. What actually happens in pressure. Moments before I tell you what happened next in that conversation, you need to understand what's actually happening in your brain during these pressure moments. When someone says or does something that your brain interprets as a threat to your status, your competence, your likability, whatever, your nervous system responds instantly. Adrenaline spikes. Your heart rate increases. Your thinking narrows. Your body prepares for fight or flight. And this happens before your conscious mind even processes what just occurred. So by the time you're deciding how to respond, you're not really deciding anything. You're being driven by a biological response system that evolved to keep you alive when confronted by physical threats. Except the threat isn't physical. It's social. It's psychological. It's often completely imagined. But your body doesn't know that. It just knows. Threat detected. Respond now. And what does that response look like? For most people, it's one of 3 patterns. Pattern 1, the immediate defense. This is where you jump in to correct, explain, defend, or justify. Your response comes fast, often before the other person has even finished speaking. You're not responding to what they actually said. You're responding to the threat your nervous system detected. And the result? You look reactive, defensive, insecure. Even if your actual words are reasonable, the energy behind them isn't. And people feel that energy more than they hear your words. Pattern 2. The over-explanation. This is similar to the first pattern, but instead of defending, you explain in detail, at length, more than necessary. You're trying to resolve the threat by making absolutely certain they understand, by leaving no room for misinterpretation, by controlling their perception through sheer volume of information. But what you're actually doing is communicating that you need their understanding, that their perception matters deeply to you, that you're not secure enough in your position to let it stand without extensive justification. Pattern 3. The collapse. This is where, instead of pushing back, you fold. You agree too quickly. You adjust your position. You soften your stance. Not because you genuinely changed your mind, but because the threat feels too uncomfortable to sit with. So you resolve it by giving in. And this communicates something even worse than defensiveness. It communicates that you can be moved easily. That pressure works on you. That you don't really stand for anything. I've been all 3 of these patterns at different times, and they all have one thing in common. They give away your power in the moment it matters most. The 3-second gap. Back to that video call, he'd just questioned my bandwidth. My instinct was screaming at me to defend, to explain, to prove, but I'd been practicing something specific, the 3-second gap. Here's how it works. When you feel that surge, that urge to react, you don't fight it. You don't suppress it. You just create space around it. 3 seconds, that's it. In those 3 seconds, you're not deciding what to say. You're letting the initial reactive impulse pass through without acting on it. It's like watching a wave. The urge to react is the wave. It rises, it peaks, and if you don't act on it, it naturally subsides. And on the other side of that wave is something completely different. Choice. So in that video call, I felt the surge. I noticed it, and I counted 1, 2, 3, and then I spoke. That's a fair question. What specific concerns do you have about deliverability? Notice what I didn't do. I didn't defend my bandwidth. I didn't list my capabilities. I didn't explain my systems or processes. I acknowledged his concern as legitimate, and I asked a clarifying question. And what happened next was fascinating. He relaxed, visibly. His entire demeanor shifted. Because he wasn't getting defensiveness, he was getting openness. He was getting someone who was secure enough to hear a concern without immediately needing to invalidate it. And from that place, we had an actual conversation. He shared his specific concerns. They were reasonable. Some of them I could address easily. One of them actually made me realize I needed to adjust my timeline slightly. And by the end of the conversation, we were collaborating on solutions instead of me defending my position. That 3-second gap changed everything. Not just the outcome of that conversation, but how he saw me, how he experienced my stability under pressure. And that became the foundation of a partnership that's now one of the most valuable in my business. All because I didn't react when every instinct told me to. The anatomy of not reacting. Let me break down what's actually happening when you successfully implement the 3-second gap. Because it's not magic. It's a very specific process. Second one, recognition. In the first second, you're recognizing what's happening, not analyzing it, not judging it. Just recognizing, I'm feeling the urge to react right now. This recognition alone is powerful, because the moment you can observe your own state, you're already separate from it. You're not completely identified with the reactive impulse anymore. Second two, allowance. In the second, you're allowing the feeling to be there without acting on it. This is crucial. You're not suppressing it. You're not fighting it. You're just letting it exist. This is where most people fail, because allowing discomfort to exist feels dangerous. It feels like you're losing control, like you're being passive, but you're not. You're actually gaining control by not being controlled by the impulse. Second three, space. In the third second, space opens up. The reactive impulse hasn't disappeared, but it's no longer the only thing present. There's room now for other possibilities, other responses, actual choice. And from that space, you can respond instead of react. The difference? A reaction is automatic. A response is intentional. A reaction comes from your nervous system. A response comes from your values, your thinking, your actual choice about how you want to engage. And that difference is everything. Real situations, real tests. Let me show you what this looks like in different contexts, because the 3-second gap isn't just for professional situations, it's for every moment where pressure appears. Test 1. The personal attack. A few months ago, I was at a family gathering. Politics came up. You know how this goes. My uncle made a comment that was clearly directed at me. Not aggressive, but definitely pointed. Questioning a life choice I'd made in a way that implied it was foolish. Old me would have responded immediately, would have defended the choice, would have listed all the reasons it made sense, would have turned a casual comment into a tense exchange. But I used a gap. 1, 2, 3, and then, interesting perspective. What would you have done differently? Not defensive, not aggressive, just curious. And you know what happened? The tension dissolved. He actually explained his thinking. I shared mine without needing him to agree. We had an actual conversation instead of a power struggle. The moment could have created distance between us. Instead, it created understanding. All because I didn't take the bait my nervous system wanted me to take. Test 2. The professional challenge. I was presenting a proposal to a client. Mid-presentation, one of the decision makers interrupted with, "I'm not seeing how this is different from what we're already doing." That question, in that moment, felt like an attack. Like my entire proposal was being dismissed. The urge to react, "Well, actually, it's very different. Let me explain all the ways it's different. Here are 10 specific differentiators." But I paused. 1, 2, 3. Good question. Which aspect of what you're currently doing does this seem similar to? Again, not defensive, not desperate to prove differentiation, just genuinely trying to understand their perception. And what I discovered, they weren't dismissing my proposal. They were trying to understand how it fit into their existing framework. My defensive explanation would have sounded like I was trying to sell them something they didn't need. But my curious question led to a conversation where I could actually address their real concern instead of the imagined threat my nervous system had created. Test 3. The silent treatment. This one's subtle but powerful. I sent a detailed message to a collaborator about a project we're working on, asked some important questions, shared some ideas, needed their input. Radio silence for 3 days. Old me would have spiraled, would have sent a follow-up, then another, would have created narratives. They're ignoring me. They're not taking this seriously. They don't respect me. And from that narrative, I would have sent increasingly anxious messages that would have actually created the dynamic I was afraid of. But I practiced the gap, extended version. Instead of reacting to the silence with anxiety and follow-ups, I asked myself, what's actually mine here? Answer: my work on the project, my decision about whether to follow up and when, my emotional state regardless of their response. What's not mine? Their timeline, their communication style, the meaning of their silence. So I continued my work. Didn't send anxious follow-ups. Stayed grounded. They responded 4 days later with thoughtful input and an apology for the delay. They've been dealing with an unexpected situation. If I'd reacted, I would have added unnecessary pressure to someone who was already dealing with something difficult, and I would have looked needy and insecure. By not reacting, I stayed solid, and our working relationship stayed strong. The deeper pattern. Here's what I've learned through hundreds of these moments. The urge to react is always based on a misperception. You perceive a threat that isn't actually there, or you perceive a threat that's much smaller than it feels in the moment. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between someone questioned my idea and a predator is attacking me. It just knows threat, respond. But when you create space, when you let that initial surge pass, you can see the situation more clearly. Most of the time, what felt like an attack is actually a legitimate question, a different perspective, a misunderstanding. Someone having a bad day, literally nothing to do with you at all. But you can't see that when you're in reactive mode. You can only see the threat your nervous system created. The 3-second gap allows you to see reality instead of your nervous system's interpretation of reality. And from that clearer perception, everything changes. The training ground now. Here's the thing about developing this skill. You can't build it in the moments you need it most. You can't practice staying calm in high-stakes situations if you haven't practiced staying calm in low-stakes situations. So I started training this in everyday moments. Small things. Low pressure. Someone cuts me off in traffic. Instead of immediate frustration, I practice the gap. 1, 2, 3. Then decide how to respond. Usually nothing. It literally doesn't matter. Someone disagrees with a casual opinion I share. Instead of immediate defense, I practice the gap. 1, 2, 3. Then, interesting. What makes you see it differently? A text doesn't get a response within the time frame I expected. Instead of creating anxious narratives, I practice the gap. 1, 2, 3. Then let it be until there's actually a reason to follow up. These small moments are the training ground. And the more you practice in low-stakes situations, the more automatic it becomes in high-stakes ones. It's like building a muscle. You don't try to deadlift 400 pounds on your first day in the gym. You start with lighter weight. You build capacity gradually. Same with this. You build your capacity to not react by practicing in moments that don't feel crucial. And over time, it becomes your default. Not something you have to think about, just how you naturally operate. What changes when this becomes automatic? About 4 months into practicing this consistently, something shifted. The 3-second gap stopped being something I had to consciously implement. It started happening automatically. Someone would say something that would have previously triggered an immediate reaction, and I'd notice myself naturally pausing before responding. Not because I was counting to 3, but because that gap had become my default. And once that happened, everything changed. Conversations became easier. I stopped feeling drained after social interactions because I wasn't spending energy managing my reactions constantly. I could just be present. Decisions became clearer. When you're not in reactive mode, you can see situations more objectively. You're not clouded by the need to respond to perceived threats. Relationships improved. People started treating me differently, with more respect, more consideration, because they could feel that I wasn't reactive, that I couldn't be easily moved or manipulated. Confidence increased, not because I was faking it, but because I genuinely knew I could handle tense moments without losing my center, and that knowledge is real confidence. Influence expanded. When you're not reactive, your words carry more weight. People listen more carefully because they know you don't speak unless you have something worth saying. All of this from one simple practice, creating space between stimulus and response. The ultimate test. The real test of this practice came about 2 months ago. I got news that a major project I'd been working on for almost a year was being shut down. Not because of anything I did wrong, just business circumstances changing. This was big. This was months of work, significant investment, real stakes, and my initial reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Frustration, disappointment, anger, panic about what this meant for my business. That's a lot more intense than someone questioned my bandwidth or someone disagreed with my opinion. But the practice held. I felt all of those emotions, strong, intense, overwhelming, but I didn't act from them. I gave myself space, not 3 seconds this time, more like 3 hours. I let myself feel everything without making any decisions or sending any messages while in that state. And as I sat with it, as I let those initial reactions move through me without acting on them, something shifted. I started seeing possibilities I couldn't see when I was in reactive mode. Ways this could actually be beneficial. Things I could do with the freed up time and energy. Projects I'd been postponing that I could now pursue. None of that was visible when I was identified with the reactive emotion. But when I created space, when I didn't react, the situation opened up. I responded to the news professionally, graciously, without blame or bitterness. And I pivoted to new opportunities that honestly ended up being better aligned with where I wanted to go anyway. But I never would have seen that if I'd reacted, if I'd acted from the initial surge of frustration and panic. The gap saved me, not just in that moment, but in the trajectory it set for the next phase of my business, the practice moving forward. Here's what I want you to take from this. Not reacting isn't about being passive. It's not about swallowing your feelings or letting people walk over you. It's about creating space between what happens and how you respond so that your response is actually yours. Not your nervous systems, not your conditionings, not your traumas. Yours. And from that place of genuine choice, you become someone who can handle anything, not because nothing bothers you, but because you're not controlled by what bothers you. That's real power, not over others, over yourself. And once you have that, once you've developed the ability to not react, even when every instinct screams at you to do so, you become genuinely unshakable. Not because you're stoic or unfeeling or detached from reality, but because you've learned to create space. And in that space, you've found freedom. Freedom from being controlled by every comment, every look, every unexpected shift in your environment. Freedom to choose how you engage with life instead of being dragged around by your automatic reactions. Freedom to be who you actually are instead of who your nervous system's threat detection system thinks you need to be to survive. That's the promise of this practice. And it's available to anyone willing to do the work. The work isn't complicated. It's just uncomfortable. Because it requires you to sit with feelings you've been avoiding your entire life, to let impulses arise without acting on them, to trust that you don't need to control every moment. But on the other side of that discomfort, a version of yourself that's grounded, clear, and genuinely powerful. The kind of person people naturally respect. The kind of person who commands presence without demanding attention. The kind of person who influences without manipulating. And all of it starts with 3 seconds. 3 seconds between what happens and how you respond. 3 seconds that change everything. But there's one more piece to this puzzle. Because even with all of this, the 3 pillars, the freedom from approval, the ability to not react, there's still a question that matters more than anything else. How do you maintain all of this when life gets genuinely hard? When the pressure isn't just momentary discomfort, but sustained difficulty? When the tests keep coming and you're tired and everything in you wants to fall back into old patterns? That's what we need to address next. Because theory only matters if it holds under real pressure. And I'm going to show you exactly how to make sure it does. The long game, when the tests never stop coming. Let's talk about the thing nobody prepares you for. You can master every technique. You can understand every principle. You can practice the 3-second gap religiously. And then life hits you with sustained pressure, not one difficult moment, an entire season where everything tests you simultaneously. That's when you discover if your transformation is real or just theoretical. The season that changed everything. 18 months ago, everything collapsed at once. A major client, 40% of my revenue, disappeared overnight. Not my fault. They got acquired, budget vanished, my relationship was falling apart. Same painful conversations on repeat, nothing improving, and my father's health crashed. Sudden, serious. The kind where every phone call makes your heart race. 3 crisis points all at once, and suddenly all my progress felt like it was slipping away. I was reacting again, seeking approval I thought I'd outgrown, adjusting myself based on others' reactions. I was exhausted, and old patterns are comfortable when you're tired. One night, sitting alone, I thought, maybe I haven't actually changed at all. Maybe it was all temporary. That thought was terrifying. The realization that saved me. But then something clicked. I was judging myself for not being perfect under pressure, but that's not what transformation is. Transformation isn't never struggling. It's struggling differently. Yes, I was reacting, but I was catching myself in hours instead of weeks. The 3-second gap sometimes became 3 minutes, but it was still there. Yes, I was seeking approval occasionally, but I noticed it happening, and I could course correct. The old me would have been consumed for months, would have made reactive decisions that destroyed everything. But this version, I was struggling while staying fundamentally grounded. And that's when I understood. The goal isn't to never be affected. The goal is to not be destroyed. The difference between struggling and breaking. There's a massive difference between these two states. Breaking looks like losing sight of who you are completely, making fear-based decisions that create long-term damage, burning bridges you can't rebuild, abandoning your values because holding them feels too hard, spiraling into patterns that make everything worse. Struggling looks like feeling the weight, but not collapsing under it, having moments of weakness, but recovering faster, reacting sometimes, but staying aware when it happens, feeling overwhelmed but moving forward anyway, doubting yourself but not giving up on yourself. I struggled hard, but I didn't break. And the reason? I'd built a foundation through months of practice in smaller moments. Every 3-second gap in a casual conversation was building muscle. Every time I dropped the approval mask, I was strengthening my core. Every time I separated what was mine from what wasn't, I was reinforcing the structure so when real pressure came, that foundation held. Not perfectly. I had cracks, but it held. The practices that held me. 3 specific practices kept me from breaking completely. Practice 1, the daily reset, every evening, 20 minutes, non-negotiable. I'd review the day and identify moments where I reacted instead of responded. No judgment, just awareness. There, that conversation. I got defensive when she questioned my decision. Then I'd visualize handling similar moments differently tomorrow. This prevented reactive moments from accumulating without awareness. It created a boundary between today and tomorrow, a chance to start fresh. That practice saved me. Practice 2, the perspective zoom. When pressure felt unbearable, I deliberately shift my time frame. How will I see this in 6 months, a year, 5 years? The client loss? 6 months later, I had better fit clients. A year later, I was grateful it forced me to diversify. The relationship struggles, they were revealing real incompatibilities that needed addressing. My father's health? I'd either be grateful I showed up fully or regret being consumed by anxiety instead of being present. The perspective zoom didn't make difficulties disappear, but it reminded me I was building something over time, not just reacting to immediate circumstances. Practice 3, the honest inventory. Once a week, complete honesty about my actual state. I'm anxious about money. I'm frustrated with my relationship. I'm scared about my dad. I'm doubting myself. I'm exhausted. I'm barely holding it together. No performance, no pretending. When you're honest about your state, you can work with it. When you're pretending to be fine, you're fighting yourself. Then I'd ask, given that this is my actual state, what's the wise choice here? Not what would a perfect person do, but what can I actually do from where I actually am? Sometimes that meant scaling back. Sometimes asking for help. Sometimes accepting I'd be less than my best for a while. This prevented me from adding suffering on top of suffering. What I learned about real strength. That season taught me what actual strength looks like. Real strength isn't never falling, it's getting up faster. I had moments where I completely lost my center, but I didn't stay there as long. Hours instead of weeks. That's real change. Real strength isn't being unaffected, it's functioning while affected. I felt everything deeply. Fear, anxiety, grief, uncertainty. But I could still make decisions, still show up, still treat people well. That's being unshakable because you can be shaken and still stand. Real strength isn't doing it alone. It's knowing when to lean on others. I used to think strength meant handling everything yourself, but that's ego, not strength. Real strength is being honest about your limits, asking for help, accepting support. I leaned on friends, got professional help, let people support me. And that didn't make me weak. It made me smart, real. Strength isn't maintaining the same standard in all conditions. It's adjusting intelligently. I had built certain standards, certain practices, and when pressure hit, I tried to maintain all of them at the same level. I kept failing. Then I realized standards need to be contextual. So I adjusted, simplified, focused on essentials, and let go of extras. That wasn't failure, that was wisdom. The turning point, 3 months into this difficult season, I was talking to a mentor about everything I was dealing with. I said, I feel like I'm barely holding it together, like I'm not being the person I worked so hard to become. He looked at me and said, You're being exactly who you worked to become. You think you were working to become someone who never faces difficulty. You were working to become someone who can face difficulty without being destroyed by it. And that's exactly what you're doing. Lightning bolt. I had been judging myself for struggling, but struggling while maintaining your foundation is the entire point. That's not failing. That's succeeding under the hardest conditions. From that moment, everything changed. Not the external circumstances, those were still difficult, but my relationship to them changed. I stopped judging myself for not being perfect under pressure. I started appreciating myself for not breaking under pressure. And that shift gave me energy I didn't know I had. The final truth. Here's what I need you to understand. Everything I've shared, the 3 pillars, freedom from approval, the 3-second gap, none of it is about becoming someone who never struggles. It's about becoming someone who struggles differently. Someone who can be in the fire without being consumed. Someone who can face pressure without fracturing. Someone who can be deeply affected by life and still make wise choices. That's what high-value thinking creates. Not perfection, not invulnerability, just the ability to stay fundamentally grounded even when everything around you is unstable. And once you have that, something remarkable happens. You stop trying to control circumstances because you know you can handle whatever arises. You stop seeking approval because you've approved of yourself in the moments that actually matter. You stop reacting to every shift because you've learned most shifts don't require a reaction. You become genuinely unshakable, not because you're rigid, but because you're rooted deeply enough that the winds can blow without toppling you. And from that place, you can build a life that's actually yours, based on your values, your desires, your authentic self. You can show up as who you actually are, fully, without apology. You can have real relationships based on genuine connection instead of approval seeking. You can make real impact based on authentic influence instead of manipulation. You can live a real life based on your truth instead of others' expectations. Your path forward, that's the promise, and it's available to you right now. Not in some distant future when you've perfected everything, not when life gets easier, not when you finally have it all figured out. Right now, in this moment, with whatever you're facing. Because transformation doesn't happen when life is perfect. It happens when life is real, and you choose to stay grounded anyway. So here's my final question. Who do you want to be when the tests come? When the pressure builds? When everything feels like it's falling apart? Because that's who you're becoming right now, in every small choice, in every moment where you pause instead of react, in every interaction where you stay grounded instead of seeking approval. You're building the foundation that will either hold or crumble when it matters most. Build it well. Build it consciously. Build it every single day, not for some perfect future version of yourself, but for the very real, very human version who will need it when life gets hard. That version is counting on you. The work is simple, not easy, but simple. Stay present, stay honest, stay grounded, and when you fall, because you will fall, get up faster than you used to. That's the game. That's the practice. That's the path. And it leads somewhere worth going, to a version of yourself that you can actually respect, that others naturally respect, that can look in the mirror and know they're living with integrity. Not perfection. Integrity. Being who you actually are. Choosing your responses instead of being controlled by reactions. Building a life that reflects your values instead of your fears. That's what this is all about. And it starts now. Right now. In this moment. With whatever you're facing, stay grounded. You've got this.